Scary telling.
I had never been so afraid in my life. The icy cold water stung my skin and every muscle in my body ached from the effort trying to stay afloat. I looked over at my daughter, who was clinging onto the piece of driftwood with all her strength. She was only 8 years old and couldn't swim. We had been on a boat trip when the storm hit us. Our boat capsized and we were the only ones who made it out alive. The storm had calmed down a bit, but the sea was still rough and the waves were high. I tried to keep my head above water and keep my daughter safe, but my body was giving up on me. I could feel myself drifting away, the cold numbing my senses. Suddenly, something wrapped around the driftwood, causing it to shake violently. I looked up, and to my horror, saw a massive tentacle wrapped around the float. I couldn't see where it was coming from, but it was clear that something was lurking in the depths below us. The tentacle tightened its grip, and my daughter and I were thrown into the water. I struggled to get back to the surface, but my body was too weak. I was sure I was going to die, but then I felt something grab onto me. I opened my eyes and saw that my daughter had managed to grab onto my arm. She was crying and shivering, but she was still alive. We clung onto each other, waiting for whatever was in the water to come back. After what felt like hours, the sea grew calm and we could see a light in the distance. It was coming from a small island, and we made our way towards it. We stumbled onto the shore and collapsed onto the sand, too exhausted to move. It wasn't until we woke up the next morning that we realized we weren't alone on the island. We woke up to the sound of footsteps crunching on the sand. My daughter sat up, rubbing her eyes, and looked at me with a confused expression. I sat up as well, scanning the area for any signs of life. That's when I saw him, a tall man in a black suit, walking towards us. "Hello there," he said, his voice smooth and composed. "You two seem to be in quite the predicament. May I ask how you ended up on this island?" I was too exhausted to answer, so my daughter spoke up. "Our boat capsized in the storm," she said, her voice trembling. "We were the only ones who made it out." The man nodded. "I see. Well, you're lucky to have found this island. It's quite isolated, but it's safe. My name is Edward, by the way." He offered us a hand, and we shook it, grateful for his help. He led us to a small cabin on the other side of the island, where he gave us food, water, and warm blankets. We told him our story, and he listened patiently, never once interrupting us. As the day went on, we started to feel more at ease. Edward seemed like a kind and caring person, and we felt safe with him. However, as the sun began to set, things started to feel off. We heard strange noises coming from outside the cabin, and every time we asked Edward about it, he would brush it off, saying it was just the wind or the local wildlife. But the noises continued, and they were getting louder and more persistent. That's when we heard it. A deep, guttural roar that seemed to come from the very depths of the island. My daughter and I huddled together, too scared to move. Edward's expression had changed, and he looked worried. "We need to leave," he said, his voice urgent. "Now." He led us out of the cabin and towards the beach, but as we got closer, we could see something moving in the water. Something huge and terrifying. It was a creature unlike anything I had ever seen before. Its massive body was covered in slimy scales, and it had dozens of writhing tentacles that seemed to stretch out for miles. My daughter screamed, and Edward grabbed our hands, pulling us towards a small boat that was anchored nearby. We scrambled onto it, and he started rowing as fast as he could. The creature was getting closer, and I could feel its breath on my neck. As we got further and further away from the island, the creature's tentacles grew weaker until they finally fell back into the water. We made it back to civilization, and my daughter and I were taken to the hospital to recover. But even now, months later, I still can't get the creature out of my mind. I don't know what it was, or where it came from, but I know one thing for sure. I never want to go back to that island again. Months had passed since the incident, and my daughter and I were still haunted by our experience on the isolated island. The memories of the terrifying creature and the strange man who had saved us kept playing over and over in our minds. One day, I received a package in the mail. It was a small wooden box with no return address or sender's name. I hesitated for a moment before opening it, wondering if it was some sort of sick joke. But curiosity got the better of me, and I carefully lifted the lid. Inside the box was a single piece of paper with a message scrawled in shaky handwriting. It read, "You have to come back. It's not safe." I felt a shiver run down my spine as I read the message. Who had sent it? And why were they warning me to go back to the island? I tried to put it out of my mind, but the memory of the creature and the mysterious man wouldn't let me rest. Eventually, I decided to go back to the island and try to uncover the truth. I booked a boat to take me there, and as I approached the island, I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. It looked the same as before, with its lush green forests and rocky cliffs. But something was different. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding, and I could feel eyes watching me from every direction. I made my way to the cabin where we had stayed before, but it was empty. There was no sign of Edward, or anyone else for that matter. I started to search the island, hoping to find some clue as to what had happened. As I was walking through the forest, I heard a twig snap behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. I started to feel like I was being followed, and I quickened my pace. That's when I saw it. The creature from before, looming in the distance. Its massive body was even more terrifying up close, and I could see its eyes gleaming in the darkness. I ran as fast as I could, but the creature was gaining on me. I could hear its tentacles whipping through the air, and I knew I was running out of time. Just when I thought all was lost, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Edward, looking older and more frail than before. He had a determined look in his eyes, and he held a strange device in his hand. "Come with me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can get us out of here." I followed him through the forest, the creature still hot on our heels. But just when it seemed like it would catch us, Edward activated the device, and a bright flash of light filled the air. When my vision cleared, we were no longer on the island. We were in a laboratory, surrounded by strange equipment and devices I couldn't even begin to understand. Edward explained everything to me. He was a scientist, and he had been studying the creature for years. He had found a way to travel between dimensions and had been using it to study the creature and its kind. But he had made a mistake. He had accidentally brought the creature to our dimension, and it had caused chaos and destruction wherever it went. We worked together to find a way to send the creature back to its own dimension, and finally, after what seemed like hours, we succeeded. The creature vanished into thin air, and we were left alone in the laboratory. "Yeah, I gotta use the bathroom before bed," I said to my friend, Sarah, as we finished up a late-night movie. I walked down the dimly lit hallway of my apartment and made my way to the bathroom. As I reached for the doorknob, I realized that the door wouldn't budge. Confused, I jiggled it a few more times before giving up and returning to the living room. "Hey, the bathroom door won't open," I said to Sarah, who was still lounging on the couch. "What do you mean? Did you try turning the knob?" "Yeah, it won't budge." "Maybe it's locked from the inside?" I shook my head. "No, I didn't hear the lock turn. Plus, I'm the only one who lives here." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "That's weird. You should probably call a locksmith or something." I nodded, feeling uneasy. But as we settled back into the movie, I tried to brush off the strange incident and focus on something else. However, over the next few days, the locked bathroom door continued to bother me. I tried everything I could think of to open it, using a screwdriver to take off the doorknob, shoving a credit card into the lock, even trying to pry it open with a crowbar. But no matter what I did, the door remained firmly shut. And then, things started to get even stranger. I began to hear noises coming from the other side of the door, shuffling footsteps, muffled voices, even the sound of running water. At first, I assumed that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But as the days went by, the sounds grew louder and more persistent, until I was sure that someone or something was in there with me. One night, as I lay in bed trying to fall asleep, I heard a faint whispering coming from the other side of the bathroom door. I couldn't make out what was being said, but it sounded like a woman's voice. I sat up in bed, straining to listen. Suddenly, the whispering stopped, and I heard a loud bang from inside the bathroom. I jumped out of bed and hurried to the door, rattling the doorknob and calling out to whoever was in there. "Hello? Is someone in there? Are you okay?" There was no response. I pressed my ear against the door, but all I could hear was my own heartbeat thudding in my ears. I backed away from the door, feeling a chill run down my spine. Something was definitely not right here. The next day, I decided to call a locksmith to see if he could open the door. When he arrived, I explained the situation to him and showed him the stubborn lock. The locksmith tried a few different tools, but the lock wouldn't budge. He suggested that we drill through the lock to open it, but I hesitated. I didn't want to cause any damage to the door or the bathroom. As the locksmith was packing up his tools, he suddenly froze, his eyes widening in alarm. "What's wrong?" I asked, peering over his shoulder. He pointed to the doorknob. "Look at that." I looked closer and saw that the doorknob was slowly turning, as if someone on the other side was trying to open the door. But we both knew that was impossible. The locksmith quickly grabbed his tools and fled, leaving me alone in the hallway with the locked bathroom door. I stared at the doorknob, my heart racing, as it continued to turn back and forth, back and forth. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the movement stopped. The bathroom fell silent once again. But I knew that something was in there, and I was determined to find out what it was. Over the next few days, I tried everything I could think of to get into the bathroom. I even went so far as to call a paranormal investigator who spent several hours in my apartment with his equipment, but he didn't find anything out of the ordinary. I was starting to feel like I was losing my mind. The sounds from the bathroom continued, and I even began to smell strange odors emanating from under the door. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard a loud crash from inside the bathroom. I bolted upright, my heart racing, and hurried to the door. "Is anyone there?" I called out, my hand on the doorknob. "What's going on in there?" There was no response. Slowly, I turned the doorknob, half expecting it to be locked as usual. But to my surprise, the door creaked open. I peered inside, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was dark, but I could make out a figure huddled in the corner. "Hello?" I said, taking a step closer. As I got closer, I could see that the figure was a woman young, with long black hair and a pale face. She was wearing a tattered white dress, and her eyes were wide with terror. "Who are you?" I asked, reaching out a hand to touch her shoulder. But as my fingers brushed against her skin, she let out a blood-curdling scream and lunged at me. I stumbled backwards, tripping over my own feet, and fell to the ground. The woman loomed over me, her eyes glowing in the darkness. And then, just as suddenly as she had attacked me, she disappeared, leaving me alone in the dark, empty bathroom. I scrambled to my feet and stumbled out of the room, gasping for air. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. The woman's face haunted my dreams, and I found myself avoiding the bathroom at all costs. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't forget the feeling of her cold, clammy skin against my fingertips. And I knew that I had to find out more about her. So one night, armed with a flashlight and a sense of dread, I ventured back into the bathroom. And what I found there would change my life forever. As I watched the strange, humanoid figure approach me, I felt a mix of fear and fascination. It was like nothing I had ever seen before. The figure was tall, thin, and almost skeletal, with skin as white as snow. Her hair was long and black, covering her face like a veil. Her clothes were tattered and ancient, and she moved with a slow, deliberate grace that seemed almost supernatural. I stood frozen in place, unable to look away as she drew closer. Her eyes were hollow and empty, but they seemed to stare directly into my soul. I could feel a chill running down my spine, and I wanted to run away, but I was too fascinated by this strange creature. It wasn't until she opened her mouth and spoke flawless English that I realized the true horror of the situation. "Hello there," she said, her voice like ice. "I've been watching you for a while now. You seem like an interesting person." I tried to speak, but my throat felt dry and constricted. I managed to croak out a weak "Who are you?" The figure smiled, but it was a cold, emotionless smile that sent shivers down my spine. "I am one of the dead," she said, "and I have a message for you." I felt my heart skip a beat. This was not what I expected. "A message?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," she said, her eyes never leaving mine. "But first, let me tell you a story." The figure began to speak in a voice that was barely above a whisper. "Many years ago, there was a small town nestled in the mountains. The people who lived there were happy and content, living simple lives filled with love and laughter. But one day, a stranger came to town, bringing with him a darkness that none of them had ever seen before." I listened intently as the figure continued her story. The stranger was tall and thin, with skin as white as snow. He wore a long black cloak and a hood that covered his face. He spoke to no one, and he kept to himself, but the people of the town could feel his presence, and they knew that he was not like them. The figure paused, and I could see a sadness in her eyes that sent chills down my spine. One by one, the people of the town began to disappear. They were taken in the dead of night, without a sound, and no one knew where they had gone. The stranger remained silent, but his presence grew stronger, and the people of the town knew that he was responsible. I felt a sense of unease creeping over me as the figure spoke. One night, a group of brave men from the town decided to confront the stranger. They went to his house, armed with pitchforks and torches, and they demanded to know what had happened to their friends and family. The figure's eyes widened, and her voice became more urgent. But when they entered the stranger's house, they found nothing. The stranger was gone, and there was no sign of their missing loved ones. The men searched high and low, but they found nothing, and they returned to the town with heavy hearts. The figure's voice trailed off, and she stared at me with a look that made my blood run cold. But the stranger was not gone. He had merely retreated into the shadows, biding his time, waiting for the right moment to strike again. I felt a sense of dread creeping over me as the figure's words sank in. "What does this have to do with me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure's eyes narrowed, and her voice became colder. "You are the descendant of one of the men who confronted the stranger," she said. "And he has not forgotten what was done to him." I felt a chill run down my spine as the figure's words sank in. "What does he want?" I asked, my voice trembling. The figure smiled, but it was a cold, cruel smile that sent shivers down my spine. "He wants revenge," she said. "And he will stop at nothing to get it." I felt a sense of unease wash over me as the figure's words sank in. "What can I do?" I asked, feeling helpless and scared. The figure's eyes glittered with an intensity that made my heart race. "You must find the stranger's house," she said. "And you must destroy him before he destroys you." I felt a sense of dread wash over me as the figure's words sank in. "But how?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure smiled again, but this time it was a warmer, more reassuring smile. "I will help you," she said. "But you must be brave, and you must trust me." I nodded, feeling a sense of hope wash over me. Maybe, just maybe, I could survive this after all. The figure led me deep into the forest, and as we walked, she told me more about the stranger and his terrible deeds. I listened, my heart racing, as she spoke of the people he had taken, the lives he had destroyed, and the darkness that seemed to follow him wherever he went. Finally, we arrived at a clearing, and in the center of the clearing stood a house. It was old and decrepit, with broken windows and a roof that sagged in the middle. But there was something about it that made my skin crawl, something that whispered of ancient evils and unspeakable horrors. The figure took my hand and led me towards the house. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew that whatever lay ahead would be dangerous, but I also knew that I had to face my fears and do what had to be done. We entered the house, and I was immediately struck by the silence. There was no sound, no movement, nothing but the creaking of old wood and the rustling of dry leaves. It was as if the entire house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. We searched the house, room by room, but there was no sign of the stranger. We found nothing but dust and cobwebs, and the musty scent of age and neglect. Finally, we reached the attic, and there, in the center of the room, stood the stranger. He was tall and thin, with skin as white as snow, just as the figure had described him. He looked at me with eyes that burned with a cold, cruel intensity. "You," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You are the descendant of the man who defied me." I felt a chill run down my spine as I looked into his eyes. There was a darkness there, a terrible, ancient darkness that seemed to reach out and consume everything in its path. The stranger smiled, but it was a cold, cruel smile that made my blood run cold. "You have come to destroy me," he said. "But you will fail, just as your ancestor did." I felt a sense of dread wash over me as his words sank in. He was right. I was just one person, and he was ancient and powerful, with powers beyond anything I could imagine. But then the figure stepped forward, and everything changed. She raised her arms, and a bright light filled the room, pushing back the darkness and banishing the shadows. The stranger screamed, a terrible, ear-splitting scream that echoed through the house and seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The stranger was gone, banished back to whatever dark corner of the universe he had come from. I felt a sense of relief wash over me as I looked around the room. Everything was back to normal, and the darkness that had once hung over the house like a shroud was gone, replaced by the warm glow of sunlight and the gentle rustling of leaves. The figure turned to me, and I could see a sense of pride in her eyes. "You did it," she said, her voice filled with awe. "You faced your fears and you conquered them." I smiled, feeling a sense of accomplishment wash over me. I had faced my fears, and I had come out on top. As we walked out of the house, I knew that I would never forget the experience, and that I would always remember the figure who had helped me face my fears and conquer the darkness.